Somewhere in a private Moscow apartment, there is said to exist a small piece of paper, yellowed now, the kind of yellowed that only decades of stillness produce. Not a letter, not a document with stamps or official signatures, not even a complete sentence. Just one word, written in careful, unhurried handwriting, as though the person who formed each letter had taken deliberate time, as though he wanted to be certain it would remain legible long after he was gone. The word is Persia. There is no date beside it, no explanation, no second thought added in the margins. And the man who wrote it, according to the woman who kept the paper for many years afterward, simply pressed it into her hand without a word, turned, and went back to his chair by the window. That man was Wolf Messing. By the autumn of 1974, he was already one of the most quietly discussed figures in Soviet popular memory, a Polish-born performer and self-described telepath who had built a career that was equal parts stage act and genuine enigma. He had demonstrated what appeared to be acts of telepathy before scientists, military observers, and at least one Soviet leader. He had survived the worst years of Stalinist suspicion, which required its own particular kind of navigation. But in his final months, Messing had largely withdrawn from the world that had once watched him so closely. He was in his mid-70s, his health was declining, and those who visited him during that period described a man who had grown noticeably quieter, thoughtful in a way that made some of them uneasy. The woman who received the note was a physician, a neighbor who came occasionally to check on his condition during those final months. She was not a journalist. She had no particular interest in predictions or mysteries. By her own account, recounted years later to a researcher documenting Messing's final period, she had assumed the note was simply a passing thought from an old man whose mind was wandering toward distant things. Elderly patients sometimes wrote things down. She placed the paper in a drawer and more or less forgot about it. She kept it not because she believed it was significant, but because it had come from his hand, and in some quiet way, she felt it deserved to be preserved. It was only much later, years after the world had changed, that she took it out again and looked at it differently. Wolf Messing had spent a life being watched. Soviet authorities had monitored his performances for years, genuinely uncertain what to make of a man who claimed to read the hidden intentions of strangers and who had, according to widely reported accounts, correctly identified information he could not plausibly have known through ordinary means. There are documented stories, some corroborated by contemporaries, others surviving only as second-hand accounts, of Messing walking through bank security by projecting a false impression onto guards, of locating a hidden child by holding an object the child had touched, of predicting outcomes that were later confirmed. Whether every detail of these accounts is fully accurate matters less than what they collectively suggest. That in the Soviet world, this particular man was never entirely ordinary, and he was never entirely left alone. Which makes the silence surrounding that final note all the more striking. If Messing had wanted to be understood, he was more than capable of explanation. He was a man who had performed before thousands of people, who had communicated across language barriers, who had constructed a public image carefully enough to survive decades of ideological scrutiny. A single word passed to a doctor without comment was not carelessness. Those who later studied his patterns of behavior noted that when Messing did not want something officially recorded, he tended toward precisely this kind of compression. Small, deniable gestures that carried weight only for those who later knew what to look for. Persia, not Soviet Central Asia, not the Arab world, not the country by its contemporary name. The old name, the ancient one, the name that carried an entire civilization inside it, the way a river carries sediment from mountains no one living has ever seen. In the autumn of 1974, Iran, still governed by Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, still regarded by most Western analysts as one of the more stable states in the Middle East, attracted relatively little dramatic attention in Soviet public discourse. The Cold War had settled into its familiar rhythms. The oil disruption of the previous year had already begun reshaping global economics, but Iran itself was not, in the eyes of most serious observers, a country standing at the edge of transformation. It was wealthy, it was modernizing, and its government maintained close and well-documented relationships with Washington. From the outside, there was very little to suggest that within 5 years, that entire architecture would collapse in one of the most unexpected political upheavals of the 20th century. And yet, one old man in Moscow wrote a word on a piece of paper and handed it away without explanation. There is a particular quality to the details that surround Messing's final months, a quiet that feels, in retrospect, carefully held. Those who visited him during that period described a man who had become selective in a new way. Not simply tired, not simply ill, selective. He would sometimes sit for long stretches without speaking, watching the Moscow streets through the window with an expression his visitors found difficult to interpret. Once, according to a recollection preserved in a later biographical account, he told a visitor that he was tired of being asked what he saw. "Seeing is not the difficult part," he reportedly said. "The difficult part is knowing that most of what is seen cannot be changed." Whether those words referred to his own mortality, to something he perceived about the wider world, or to something far more specific, no one who heard them could afterward say with any certainty. The doctor kept the note for over a decade before mentioning it to anyone. When she finally spoke about it, quietly, to a researcher gathering materials on Messing's later years, she said she had not immediately brought it forward after the Iranian Revolution in 1979. She had thought about it. Something stopped her. Perhaps she feared being misunderstood. Perhaps she was unsure herself what the note had meant. Perhaps she simply held it a little longer, the way people sometimes hold objects that feel, for reasons they cannot fully articulate, like they carry weight beyond their physical size. One word. One country named by its ancient identity. One old man pressing a piece of paper into a neighbor's hand and then returning, without explanation, to his chair by the window. What exactly he saw from that chair, or somewhere beyond it, remains to this day an open question. The town of Petrich sits at the southwestern edge of Bulgaria, pressed between the Struma River and the long dark ridge of the Belasica mountain range. It is a quiet place, the kind of town that exists at the margins of larger histories, noticed mostly by those who have a reason to go there. In the 1970s, people came to Petrich from across the Soviet bloc for one reason almost exclusively. They came to sit in a small stone house near the edge of town, in a room that smelled of dried herbs and earth, and speak to a blind woman who had spent the better part of her life receiving things that other people could not perceive. Her name was Vanga, and the world she inhabited was entirely her own. She had lost her sight as a child during a violent storm that lifted her from the ground and left her buried under debris for hours. When they found her, her eyes were filled with soil and sand that could not be fully treated. Darkness became permanent. But those who spent time with her in later years described a quality of attention that was almost disorienting. The way she would turn her face toward a visitor before they spoke, as though sound was only one channel among several she was monitoring. She moved through her house without hesitation, navigating by memory and by something her assistants struggled to name. She knew the herbs growing in her garden by touch and by scent, and she reportedly rubbed soil between her fingers before certain sessions in a gesture some interpreted as grounding herself, though she never explained it in those terms. By the early 1970s, Vanga had been receiving visitors for decades. They came from Bulgaria, from the Soviet Union, from Eastern Europe and beyond. Ordinary people seeking personal news, grieving families asking after lost relatives, and, according to accounts that surfaced much later, occasional official visitors whose presence was not publicized. A translator who worked with her regularly during this period described the rhythm of her sessions as remarkably consistent. Visitors would sit close. She would hold an object they had brought, or sometimes simply their hand. She would speak in a low, measured voice in the old Macedonian dialect she had grown up with, and her words would be rendered into standard Bulgarian or Russian for those who needed it. Most sessions were deeply personal. Most of what she said concerned individual lives, which is what made the interruptions so unusual. According to the same translator, who described the event in a recorded interview given many years later, it happened sometime during 1974. The exact date was not noted. A visitor was seated across from Vanga, and the session had already begun. There was nothing remarkable about the opening of the consultation. Vanga was holding something the visitor had brought, speaking in her usual unhurried way when she stopped. Not paused in the natural rhythm of speech, stopped completely, her hands stilled. She sat without moving for what the translator estimated as several seconds, long enough that the visitor looked up, uncertain whether something was wrong. Then Vanga spoke, quietly and without explanation, in words that had no visible connection to the person sitting in front of her. Where silk and fire once ruled, a new word will come, and the world will hear it. The translator rendered the phrase and then waited for clarification. Vanga did not offer any. She set down the object she had been holding, folded her hands in her lap, and told the visitor the session was finished. The visitor, confused, clearly not having received what they had come for, was guided out. Vanga did not resume work that day. The translator later recalled asking her carefully what she had meant. Vanga's response, as the translator remembered it, was brief and not particularly illuminating. She said only that some things come when they choose to come, and that it was not her role to explain them before they arrived. Then she asked for water and sat quietly by the window. What is notable about this account is not the phrase itself. Vanga was known for speaking in layered symbolic language that resisted straightforward interpretation, but the context in which it appeared. The interruption of an existing session, the abrupt departure from personal subject matter, the refusal to explain or continue, these were not, by her translator's account, typical behaviors. Most of Vanga's unusual statements were made within the flow of a consultation, connected, however loosely, to the person she was addressing. This one arrived entirely unbidden, addressed apparently to no one in the room, and was followed by an unusual withdrawal. It was as though something had moved through the session from outside it, using her voice briefly and then receding. For years, almost no one outside the immediate circle attached significance to the phrase. Bulgaria in 1974 was not a country where such statements were casually publicized, and Vanga herself made no reference to it in subsequent sessions, or at least none that were recorded. The translator preserved it in personal notes. A staff member who had been present remembered it when asked about it much later. It remained for nearly 5 years one of dozens of unusual fragments from Vanga's long history of inexplicable moments, filed away in the particular category of things that seem like they should mean something but resist being pinned down. Then came 1979, and the world that had been stable, or at least the world that had appeared stable, shifted in ways that almost no official institution had anticipated. In a country that had once been called Persia, that stood at the crossing of ancient trade routes where silk and fire had indeed once defined an entire civilization, a revolution unfolded that changed the political architecture of an entire region. And somewhere in Petrich, in a drawer or a private folder, the phrase that had arrived uninvited in a small stone house 5 years earlier sat waiting to be looked at differently. Whether it deserved that new attention, whether it had truly pointed toward that event, or whether human memory simply reaches backward to find shapes that match what already happened, is a question the evidence alone cannot settle. But the phrase existed. It had been spoken, and those who had heard it had not forgotten it. To understand what made certain observers uneasy about Iran in the early 1970s, it helps first to see the country as most of the world saw it, because the distance between that image and what was actually accumulating beneath it is precisely where the strangeness begins. From the outside, and for most of the decade, Iran looked like a success. Not a fragile success hedged with visible tensions, but a confident, forward-moving one, the kind that invites investment and generates the particular complacency that comes when powerful people decide a situation no longer needs close watching. The Shah presided over a state that was, by many measurable standards, transforming rapidly and in directions that Western governments found deeply reassuring. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi had ruled Iran since 1941, initially under considerable foreign influence, but by the early 70s, he had consolidated a degree of personal authority that made him appear genuinely unassailable. The revenues pouring in from oil, dramatically amplified after the price increases of 1973, were being directed, at least visibly, into the architecture of a modern state. Tehran was expanding outward in every direction. New highways cut through neighborhoods that had existed for centuries. Universities multiplied. A national television network carried programming into homes that had held only silence a generation before. The Shah spoke publicly about what he called the Great Civilization, a vision of Iran as a future industrial power taking its place alongside the most developed nations on Earth. Foreign journalists who visited Tehran during this period often described a city in vigorous, almost impatient motion. The relationship between Iran and the Western powers, particularly the United States, was close and well documented. American military advisors operated within the country in considerable numbers. Weapons contracts flowed steadily. Intelligence sharing between the Shah's government and Western agencies was extensive, formalized through years of mutual interest in regional stability. The Savak, the Iranian secret police, was regarded by its Western partners primarily as a useful instrument for suppressing the kind of internal disorder that might complicate those arrangements. That it was also generating a depth of popular resentment that would eventually prove impossible to contain was, in most official assessments of the period, either underestimated or quietly set aside. The architecture of the alliance mattered more, for the moment, than the tensions building inside the walls. From Moscow, the picture was necessarily different. Not because Soviet analysts possessed any particular prophetic clarity, but because they were watching from the other side of an alliance and therefore attending to different details. Iran shared a long border with Soviet territory. The Shah's government was openly aligned with Washington. Soviet strategic interest in the region was substantial and old, reaching back through Tsarist ambitions toward warm water access and southward influence that the 20th century had rerouted but never entirely extinguished. Soviet analysts studying Iran were not looking for signs of revolution. They were tracking military posture, energy politics, and the shifting geometry of American influence in a region the USSR considered part of its extended strategic perimeter. Their attention was professionally cold and thoroughly self-interested. And yet something in the pattern of that attention, according to accounts that emerged gradually in the post-Soviet period, appears to have shifted during the early 1970s in ways that were not entirely explained by conventional strategic logic. Several former analysts, speaking in interviews given after the Soviet Union's dissolution, described an increased focus on Iran during this period that went beyond standard monitoring. One researcher, who had worked within an institute connected to long-range regional forecasting, described what he called an unusual concentration of resources on a country that, by official metrics, presented no immediate crisis requiring special attention. When pressed on what had prompted this concentration, he was careful with his words. He said only that certain inputs, he didn't specify their nature, had suggested the region deserved a longer horizon than current analysis was applying to it. What those inputs were, he didn't say on the record. Whether they included anything as unconventional as the observations reportedly being made in a Moscow apartment or a stone house in southern Bulgaria is not something any document has confirmed. But the timing is worth holding. Messing's note, by the account of the physician who received it, was given to her sometime during 1974. Vanga's interrupted session, by her translator's recollection, also occurred during 1974. And according to the same former analyst, the period of heightened internal focus on Iran within his institution corresponded broadly to the mid-1970s. 3 separate threads, each thin on its own, each arriving, however, from a different direction and pointing, however obliquely, toward the same place. The Iran that existed in 1974 was not a country visibly approaching revolution. Its streets were not yet filled with the demonstrations that would come. The mosques were active, but the depth of organized opposition forming within the religious establishment was largely invisible to external observers, and reportedly underestimated even by the Savak itself. The Shah continued to receive foreign dignitaries with the assurance of a man who believed his foundations were solid. Oil revenues continued to rise. The military continued to modernize. By every surface measurement, the great civilization was proceeding more or less on schedule. And yet beneath that surface, beneath the highways and the new university buildings and the carefully managed press photographs, something had been accumulating for years. A pressure that official instruments were not calibrated to detect, or perhaps had reasons not to report accurately upward through the chain. That is the particular quality of what would unfold 5 years later. It surprised almost everyone who had been watching officially, and yet in retrospect, it appeared to have been inevitable to anyone who had been watching the right things. The question that certain researchers would eventually begin to ask, quietly, without making strong claims, was whether the right things were visible in 1974 to two individuals who had spent their lives attending to precisely the dimensions of human reality that official instruments ignored. One of them pressed a word onto a piece of paper in Moscow. One of them interrupted a consultation in a stone house in Petrich to speak a phrase no one in the room had asked for. The ancient name. The image of silk and fire, as though somewhere in the register these two people moved through, something about Iran was already in motion, already crossing the threshold from future to present, years before the world's analysts caught even the faintest signal of what was coming. There is a particular kind of institutional memory that survives not in what was written down, but in what was deliberately left unwritten. Files that were never opened, reports that circulated in single copies and were returned rather than filed, meetings recorded only as dates in a calendar with no agenda attached. The Soviet bureaucratic system, for all its reputation for relentless documentation, understood perfectly well that certain categories of work left cleaner traces when they produced no traces at all. And some of the most careful silences in that system surround a cluster of analytical activities that former participants, speaking decades after the fact, have described only in fragments, each fragment consistent with the others, none of them individually verifiable, all of them pointing toward the same general shape. What can be said with reasonable confidence is that the Soviet Union, throughout the Cold War, maintained a network of research institutions nominally dedicated to political science, regional studies, and long-range international forecasting. Some of these were publicly acknowledged. The Institute of World Economy and International Relations, for instance, produced visible work and employed scholars whose names appeared in academic publications. Others occupied a less clearly defined position between open research and closed analytical work, their outputs directed not toward publication, but toward internal consumers whose identities were rarely specified in the documents that did survive. It was within this second category, according to several accounts given in the 1990s and early 2000s by former Soviet researchers, that certain unconventional activities were reportedly housed. The word unconventional requires some care here. In the context of Soviet institutional life during the 1970s, it did not necessarily mean fringe or disreputable. The Soviet scientific establishment had, since at least the 1960s, maintained a serious, if contested, interest in phenomena that Western academic institutions tended to categorize and dismiss more quickly. The study of human perception beyond ordinary sensory channels. The investigation of individuals who appeared to demonstrate unusual capacities for information processing. The question of whether certain people possessed what researchers carefully called heightened intuitive judgment rather than using language that would have attracted ideological criticism. These programs existed. Some of them have been partially documented. Their relationship to mainstream intelligence and forecasting work is what remains genuinely obscure. Several former analysts, interviewed by Russian journalists and independent researchers in the years following the Soviet collapse, described the existence of what they called small working groups that operated within larger institutions during the 1970s and into the 80s. Their official designations, where any designation was recalled at all, were anodyne, terms suggesting regional studies or methodological research. Their actual function, as these former participants described it, was to develop what one man called a wider aperture for long-range assessment. Standard forecasting, he explained, relied on documented trends, measured indicators, official statements, and intercepted communications. What these groups were exploring was whether there existed other categories of input, softer, harder to systematize, but potentially valuable precisely because they accessed dimensions of a situation that conventional analysis structurally could not reach. Whether individuals such as Wolf Messing or Vanga were formally consulted as part of any such program is a question that sits at the center of several accounts and the edge of all the available evidence. No document has been made public confirming direct institutional contact with either of them in this context. But what certain researchers noted when they began asking questions in the post-Soviet period was not the presence of a clear denial. It was the absence of any record at all. Archives that should, by the normal logic of Soviet bureaucratic procedure, have contained at minimum administrative correspondence about both figures, contained, for certain periods, nothing. Not redacted files, not classified folders held back from public access, simply gaps. Sequences in which documentation existed before and after a particular window, with the window itself empty. One archivist, quoted in a 1998 Russian publication, described this pattern as unusual even by the standards of a system that regularly withheld sensitive material. Withheld material leaves a trace, she noted. An empty shelf does not. The specific period in which these gaps most consistently appeared was, according to several independent researchers who worked in different archives and compared notes afterward, the early to mid-1970s. Not the entirety of either Messing's or Vanga's documented histories. Materials from earlier and later periods were largely present and accessible. But the years surrounding 1974, across multiple relevant institutional collections, showed a pattern of absence that some researchers found difficult to account for through ordinary explanations of archival loss, routine destruction, or standard classification. One researcher described spending several months attempting to trace a specific category of internal communications between two institutions during this period and finding, repeatedly, that the thread simply stopped and resumed on the other side of a gap she could not bridge. It would be easy, and perhaps tempting, to build a confident structure from these absences, to treat the missing files as confirmation of something that happened in those rooms during those years. But that would be precisely the kind of reasoning that the actual evidence does not support. Gaps in Soviet archives have many explanations. Bureaucratic disorder, deliberate destruction during the transition period of the late 1980s and early 90s, when a great deal of sensitive material was reportedly eliminated. Misfiling, water damage, the ordinary entropy that affects paper over decades in storage conditions that were not always adequate. Any or all of these explanations might account for what researchers found or failed to find. The honest position is that the absences are real and their cause is unknown. What the former participants did consistently describe, however, and this is perhaps the most concrete thread available, was the seriousness with which certain Soviet institutions approached the question of non-standard information sources during this period. Not as curiosity, not as ideology, as methodology. One former researcher described attending a meeting in the early 1970s at which a senior figure in his institution presented what was described as a comparative analysis of prediction accuracy across different source types: official intelligence, economic modeling, open source political analysis, and a fourth category, unnamed in the formal presentation, which he understood from context to refer to individuals whose outputs had been tracked over time and assessed for reliability. The presentation, he recalled, was entirely matter of fact. There was no discussion of how such individuals arrived at their assessments, only whether their assessments, measured against outcomes, performed better or worse than the other source types. The answer, according to what he remembered being shown, was that in certain categories of long-range regional forecasting, the fourth source type had an accuracy record that the institution had found worth continuing to monitor. He did not name the individuals involved. He said he did not know their names. He said the outputs were referred to in the materials he saw only by numerical designations. Whether one of those designations corresponded to an elderly man writing a single word on a piece of paper in Moscow, or to a blind woman in a stone house in Petrich suddenly speaking of silk and fire, is something the available evidence does not confirm. But it does not exclude it either. And in a story built substantially from absences and careful silences, the space between those two positions is precisely where the most important questions continue to live. Wolf Messing had a long history of saying less than he knew. This was not evasiveness in the ordinary sense, not the practiced deflection of a man protecting secrets he had been instructed to keep. It was something more deliberate and more personal than that. Those who spent time around him over the years described a man who had developed, through long experience, a precise economy of disclosure. He understood, apparently early in his life, that the full expression of whatever he perceived would not serve him well. In the Soviet context, it would not have served anyone well. And so he learned to compress, to suggest rather than state, to leave enough unsaid that what remained could be absorbed without triggering the particular kind of official attention that direct claims tended to invite. His public career had been built on demonstrations that walked a careful line. The stage performances, conducted before audiences across the Soviet Union from the 1930s onward, were framed as experiments in psychological suggestion, in the reading of unconscious muscular signals, in what he was careful to call the transfer of mental images rather than anything that carried more charged terminology. Soviet ideology had limited patience for language that implied capacities outside the materialist framework, and Messing, who had survived enough to understand where the edges were, stayed within acceptable description even when what he was demonstrating appeared to exceed it. Scientists who observed his performances and later wrote about them used similar circumspection. What they documented was the outcome, the accuracy, the repeatability, the failure of conventional explanations to fully account for what they witnessed, without committing to conclusions the framework of their institutions would not have supported. The encounters with Stalin, reported through multiple accounts of varying reliability, followed a similar pattern of careful indirection. According to the versions that circulated most persistently, and which several former Soviet cultural figures described hearing from contemporaries who claimed direct knowledge, Messing was summoned on more than one occasion to demonstrate his abilities before senior Soviet leadership, including Stalin himself. The details of these accounts differ in their particulars. What they share is a consistent portrait of Messing performing under conditions that were designed to be impossible to fake, succeeding, and then navigating the aftermath with extreme care. Stalin, by several accounts, was genuinely disturbed by what he witnessed and responded with the particular kind of controlling interest he directed toward things he could not categorize. Messing was monitored. He was also, evidently, protected, which in the Soviet system were often the same gesture made from different angles. What is documented with more certainty is the series of public demonstrations during which Messing performed acts that credentialed observers found genuinely difficult to explain. In one widely reported episode, he was challenged to withdraw a specific sum of money from a savings bank using a blank piece of paper, relying on nothing more than his apparent ability to project a compelling false impression onto the teller. The withdrawal was successfully completed, witnessed by a physicist and a psychologist who had been brought specifically to ensure the conditions were controlled. In another, he reportedly identified a hidden individual in a city he had never visited by working from a sealed description of the person's location, revising his route in real time as he narrowed the search. These are not accounts from credulous admirers. They are accounts from people whose professional credibility was staked on accurate observation and who reported what they saw with varying degrees of discomfort. But it was the refusals that those who knew him found most revealing in retrospect. There were periods, none of them publicly explained, none of them long enough to constitute a formal withdrawal, during which Messing declined engagements without offering reasons. He would cancel scheduled performances. He would become briefly unreachable. Associates who asked him why received answers that were politely uninformative. One colleague, recalling such a period in a memoir published after Messing's death, wrote that he had once pressed him directly, asking whether something was wrong. Messing had reportedly looked at him for a moment and then said simply that there were times when the distance between what he perceived and what he was able to say about it became too uncomfortable to perform through. The colleague wrote that he had not known what to make of this at the time. He wrote that he thought about it frequently afterward. By the early 1970s, those who visited Messing in his Moscow apartment described a man who had arrived at a new and more settled version of this reticence. The performances were largely behind him. The official scrutiny had relaxed somewhat with age. He was no longer the active subject of institutional interest in quite the same way, or at least the active interest had become less visible. He read. He sat by his window. He received occasional visitors, some of them old friends, some of them researchers, some of them simply people who had sought him out because of his reputation and whom he received with varying degrees of engagement. Former acquaintances from this period, interviewed years later, consistently described a man who had grown not diminished, but condensed, as though everything that had once expressed itself outwardly had been drawn inward and was now moving at a slower, more considered pace. Several of these acquaintances recalled something that, taken individually, might seem unremarkable, but becomes more pointed when placed alongside the note. A sense that Messing in his final years was waiting. Not in the anxious way of someone expecting bad news, in the way of someone who has already received information and is watching for the moment when the world catches up to it. One former colleague described a conversation in which Messing had said something that stayed with her for years. She recalled him observing, in the course of an otherwise ordinary exchange, that the most difficult thing about perceiving events before they occurred was not the perception itself, but the interval, the stretch of time between knowing and witnessing, during which the knowledge sat in you like an object you could not put down and could not fully carry. She had understood this at the time as a reflection on his own mortality. She was less certain later that mortality was entirely what he had meant. When the physician who received the note returned to it after 1979, what struck her, by her own account, was not the word itself, but the handwriting. She had seen Messing's handwriting on other occasions, the small notes he sometimes left when she had visited and he had been asleep. It was typically rapid, a little uneven, the writing of a man whose hand moved to keep pace with a mind that ran faster than the available space on paper. But the word on the note was written differently. Each letter formed with what she described as unusual deliberateness, as though he had taken time with it, as though he had wanted it legible not just to her, but to anyone who might eventually look at it. One word, pressed into the hand of a doctor who was not a researcher, not an analyst, not a figure in any institution that might have acted on it. A doctor who would simply keep it. The choice of recipient, viewed through the lens of everything else Messing is known to have understood about the world he moved through, seems less random the longer you consider it. He did not give the note to someone who would file it. He gave it to someone who would hold it. And hold it she did, for years across one of the most consequential political transformations of the 20th century, until the weight of what she was holding finally required her to speak. The phrase, as it was first recorded by the translator who heard it, read as follows: "Where silk and fire once ruled, a new word will come, and the world will hear it." That is one version. A second account, provided by a staff member who was present in the house that day and who gave a separate recollection to a Bulgarian researcher in the early 1990s, rendered it slightly differently. In the land where silk passed and fire was kept sacred, something new is being named. The world will not be ready for it. A third version, appearing in a privately circulated document whose provenance has never been fully established, offers yet another variation in which the phrase about silk is absent entirely and only fire is mentioned, though in connection with a river and a mountain, which some later readers interpreted as geographic rather than symbolic. 3 versions, none of them identical, all of them sharing a core of imagery that, when traced historically, leads to the same place with a consistency that is difficult to attribute entirely to coincidence. Silk, in the context of the ancient world, was not simply a fabric. It was a system. The network of trade routes running from the Chinese interior westward through Central Asia, through the Iranian plateau, through Mesopotamia and into the Mediterranean, what later historians would consolidate under the name the Silk Road, had Persia not merely at its edge, but at its center. The great Persian empires of antiquity did not simply permit the passage of silk through their territory. They shaped it, taxed it, protected it, and absorbed it into their own culture in ways that were transformative in both directions. Persian merchants, Persian administrators, Persian cities were structural elements of the network for more than 1,000 years. To say silk passed through Persia is accurate but insufficient. A more precise statement would be that for a significant portion of its history, the Silk Road was in part a Persian institution, maintained by Persian political will, animated by Persian commercial energy, defined by the particular geography of a plateau that had no practical alternative route around it. Fire requires a different kind of attention, because in the context of Persian civilization, it carries a weight that is simultaneously religious, philosophical, and civilizational. Zoroastrianism, the faith that shaped Persian identity for millennia, that influenced Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in ways scholars continue to debate, placed fire at the center of its cosmology not as a metaphor, but as a living presence. The sacred fires maintained in Zoroastrian temples were never extinguished. Some of them, by the accounts of religious historians, burned continuously for centuries. The oldest still burning sacred fire in Iran is documented as having been maintained without interruption for well over 1,000 years. Fire in the Persian tradition was not destruction. It was truth made visible, the physical presence of Ahura Mazda, the principle of light and wisdom in the material world. To rule under fire in this framework was to claim alignment with a cosmic order that preceded and would outlast any particular political arrangement. Whether Vanga possessed conscious knowledge of Zoroastrian theology or the detailed history of Silk Road commerce is a question that her close associates answered consistently in the negative. She had received little formal education. Her life had been spent in a small Bulgarian town at the margins of academic culture. Those who worked with her did not describe a woman who had absorbed historical scholarship through reading or study. What they described was something harder to characterize, an apparent ability to arrive at images and phrases that carried historical or symbolic accuracy without the evident pathway through which such accuracy would normally be acquired. This is precisely the quality that made her difficult to categorize within any conventional framework, and it is also what makes the phrase worth examining without the assumption that its symbolic density was consciously constructed. Because if the phrase was not consciously constructed, if it arrived, as her translator's account suggests, unbidden and without visible connection to what was happening in the room, then what it contains is more interesting than if it had been researched and deliberate. The Silk Road, the sacred fire, the suggestion of a new naming that the world would not expect. Placed together, these images form something that functions less like a prediction in the ordinary sense and more like a description of a place rendered in the terms by which that place had defined itself for the longest portion of its existence before any of the modern categories through which the outside world had learned to understand it were applied. Iran in 1974 was known to the world primarily through the language of oil, of Cold War alignment, of modernization and military capacity. What Vanga's phrase invoked, if it pointed to Iran at all, was not that Iran. It was the older one, the one that existed in the layers beneath the highways and the new university buildings, in the mosques and the memory and the particular pride of a civilization that had never entirely reconciled itself to being understood on other people's terms. And then there is the modern fire, which is perhaps the most uncomfortable layer of the phrase for anyone inclined to treat it as purely historical imagery. Iranian oil had been referred to in Soviet-era analytical and journalistic documents on several documented occasions through fire-related language. The region's underground fire, the fire beneath the desert, the fire that powers the century. These were rhetorical conventions of the period, not unique to Soviet usage, but their presence in materials that circulated within institutions that were, by some accounts, also gathering Vanga's statements, creates a particular kind of resonance. Whether the phrasing in those documents was coincidentally similar to hers, or whether someone reading her phrase later applied the existing metaphorical vocabulary of energy politics to it retrospectively, or whether something more deliberate was occurring in either direction, is genuinely unclear. The timing and the language overlap. The explanation does not. The variation between the three recorded versions of the phrase has been noted by every researcher who has examined this material, and it deserves to be addressed directly rather than smoothed over. In oral testimony filtered through translation and recalled across a gap of years, some variation is expected and does not by itself undermine the core account. What is notable is that the variation occurs in the peripheral details, the precise framing of silk, the specific verb used for fire, the presence or absence of certain connecting phrases, while the central imagery remains consistent across all three versions. Silk, fire. A new word rising. The world receiving something it had not anticipated. This consistency across independent recollections, each provided without apparent coordination, is treated by some researchers as evidence that the phrase was real and that the versions represent natural divergence in human memory rather than fabrication. Others note that consistent central imagery in varied accounts can also be the product of a shared story, told and retold until it stabilizes around its most striking elements. Both readings are possible. The phrase itself, whatever its precise original form, has not been convincingly explained away by either argument. It existed. It was heard by more than one person, and what it contained, when traced patiently through the history of the land it most plausibly described, formed a map that required no commentary to make its direction clear. In January of 1979, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi boarded a plane and left Iran. He carried with him a jar of Iranian soil, a detail reported by those who witnessed his departure, and one that carried the particular weight of a gesture made by a man who understood, in that moment, that he was not leaving temporarily. He would never return. The country he had ruled for nearly 4 decades, the country his father had shaped before him, the country he had tried to steer toward what he called a great civilization, that country was, within weeks, no longer his in any sense that the world recognized. By February, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini had landed at Tehran's Mehrabad airport to a reception of millions. The images transmitted around the world that day had a quality that few news photographs possess. Not the quality of an event being captured, but of a transformation being witnessed, the kind that divides time into before and after so cleanly that the division becomes permanent. What followed over the next months, the dismantling of the Shah's institutional framework, the establishment of an Islamic republic, the prolonged crisis that began in November when student militants seized the American embassy and held its staff captive for 444 days, did not merely change Iran. It reconfigured the political geometry of an entire region and sent tremors through every calculation that Western governments had been building for years on the assumption of Iranian stability. The alliance structure of the Middle East shifted in ways that analysts would spend decades attempting to fully map. The relationship between political Islam and state power entered a new phase that the existing vocabulary of Cold War analysis was not equipped to describe. Oil markets, already sensitized by the events of 1973, absorbed another shock. And the United States, whose relationship with the Shah had been so close, so well-funded, and so publicly visible, discovered that the intimacy of that alliance had somehow produced a blindness rather than a clarity about what was building beneath it. The intelligence failure surrounding the Iranian Revolution is not a matter of retrospective interpretation or partisan argument. It is documented. CIA assessments from the mid-1970s, portions of which were later declassified and reviewed by independent analysts, consistently characterized Iran as stable and the Shah's position as secure. A formal assessment produced in the summer of 1978, just months before the Shah's departure, described Iran as not in a revolutionary or even pre-revolutionary situation. This was not a minor miscalculation buried in a footnote. It was a central analytical judgment delivered to senior decision-makers at a moment when the streets of Tehran were already filling with protest and the signals of structural collapse were, in retrospect, visible in multiple places simultaneously. The failure was not one of missing information. It was a failure of framework, of the conceptual architecture through which the available information was being processed. The instruments were reading the surface, and the surface still looked, by its own metrics, broadly intact. British intelligence assessments of the same period, elements of which entered the public record through parliamentary proceedings and later journalistic investigation, told a broadly similar story. The prevailing estimate held that while internal pressures existed, the Shah's government retained sufficient capacity to manage dissent through a combination of security force action and limited political concession. Israeli intelligence, which had maintained particularly close relationships with Iranian counterparts under the Shah and possessed unusually deep penetration of the country's institutional landscape, reportedly reached conclusions in its internal reviews that their analysts had systematically underweighted the religious dimension of the opposition's organizational capacity. The mosque network, the clerical hierarchy, the depth of popular attachment to figures like Khomeini, who had been in exile but never in obscurity, these had been present in the available data and had not been given the weight they deserved. The post-mortems were thorough. They were also, by their own admission, exercises in understanding how so much had been missed by so many people watching so carefully. It is worth pausing here, without dramatization, to simply place certain dates alongside each other and allow the proximity to speak. The CIA's formal stable assessment, 1978. Wolf Messing's note bearing the single word Persia, 1974. Vanga's interrupted session in which she spoke of silk and fire and a new word rising, also 1974. The Shah's departure from Iran, January 1979. Khomeini's return, February 1979. No argument is being made here about causation or about the nature of whatever process produced the note and the phrase. The dates are simply what they are. The intelligence establishment of the most powerful Western nations, with all its resources and personnel and analytical infrastructure, was formally describing Iran as stable in 1978. And 5 years before that, in a Moscow apartment and a Bulgarian stone house, two people had produced fragments pointing toward a transformation in Persia, the ancient land beneath the modern state, that the official world would not see until it arrived. The physician who kept Messing's note later described watching the television coverage of the revolution with a feeling she found difficult to articulate. She had not retrieved the note from her drawer to look at it during those weeks. She said she did not need to. She remembered the word precisely. What she found herself thinking about, watching Khomeini's plane descend toward Tehran, was not the note itself, but the handwriting, the deliberate, unhurried quality she had noticed when Messing pressed it into her hand, as though each letter had been formed with the awareness that it would need to survive an interval before it was understood, an interval of years during which it would simply wait, legible and unexplained, in a drawer in Moscow. In Petrich, there is no equivalent account of Vanga watching the coverage and making a connection to what she had said in 1974. She did not operate in that way. She rarely referred back to previous statements, and those who worked around her did not describe her as someone who tracked the fulfillment of her own words with any visible satisfaction. What the translator who had recorded the phrase did describe in the interview given years later was a conversation with a colleague shortly after the revolution in which both of them remembered the interrupted session of 1974 without having to prompt each other. They had, it appeared, both been carrying it. Neither had spoken of it publicly in the intervening years. Neither had known what to do with it. The revolution had not answered the question of what Vanga's phrase meant. It had simply made the question impossible to continue setting aside. That is the particular texture of this moment in the story, not a revelation, not a confirmation, but a threshold. The world had now produced the event that certain fragments from 1974 could plausibly be read as having anticipated. Whether they had actually done so, whether the reading was valid or merely the natural human impulse to find pattern in the aftermath of shock, was a question that nobody involved was in a position to answer definitively. What changed after 1979 was not the evidence. The note had not grown more specific. The phrase had not become more precise. What changed was the context in which both of them existed. And in that changed context, people who had held these fragments quietly for 5 years began, slowly and separately, to ask whether they had been holding something more than the passing thoughts of two aging figures whose minds had wandered toward the distant and the ancient. The question, once formed, proved difficult to put back down. Memory is not a reliable archive. It shifts under pressure, reorganizes itself around significant events, and tends, particularly when those events carry emotional weight, to retrieve earlier experiences in forms that have been quietly reshaped by everything that came afterward. This is not a failing unique to any particular witness or any particular era. It is simply how human recollection works, and any serious examination of testimony gathered years after the fact has to hold this understanding in the foreground. The accounts that began to surface in the early 1980s and continued appearing through the 1990s from people who had known Messing or Vanga during the early part of that decade, or who claimed proximity to people who had, carry this caveat openly. They are not documents. They are memories. And memories of things that, at the time they were formed, seemed unremarkable enough that no one thought to record them carefully. What makes them worth examining, despite this limitation, is not any individual account taken alone. It is the pattern that emerges when they are placed alongside each other, the consistency of certain details across accounts given independently by people with no evident reason to coordinate their recollections over a span of years that makes deliberate fabrication of a coherent false narrative an increasingly implausible explanation. Not impossible, but implausible. And in the absence of documentary evidence either confirming or definitively refuting what these witnesses described, plausibility is the measure that serious researchers have had to work with. Among the earliest accounts to surface was that of a retired Bulgarian official. His name was not published in the source that described the conversation, identified only by his former institutional role, who spoke with a journalist in the late 1980s while the Soviet bloc was still formally intact but already visibly loosening. He had visited Vanga on at least 2 occasions during the early 1970s, and he described his experiences in terms that were measured and careful, the language of a man who had spent a professional lifetime choosing words in contexts where imprecision had consequences. What he said about Vanga's statements from that period was specific in a way that distinguishes it from the more general accounts that circulated more widely. He did not refer to a single interrupted session. He said he had heard her speak on more than one occasion across separate visits about what he recalled her describing as a great fire in the land of the ancient road. Not the same phrase each time, not a scripted repetition, but a recurring image, fire, an ancient road, a place associated with both, that he said he had initially interpreted as religious metaphor and later, after 1979, had returned to with a different understanding. The journalist who recorded this account noted that the official had not volunteered the information. It had emerged in the course of a longer conversation about Vanga's general patterns of speech, and the official had mentioned it almost in passing before catching himself and becoming more circumspect. He did not want, he said, to be understood as making claims that he could not support. What he could say was that he had heard her use this imagery more than once, that he had not understood it at the time, and that afterward he had thought about it frequently. He offered this not as proof of anything, but as a personal record, something he had carried and that seemed, given everything that had happened, worth mentioning to someone who might know what to do with it. The Moscow physician's account came to light differently. It did not emerge through a journalist, but through a colleague, a fellow doctor who described the conversation in a letter written sometime in the mid-1980s and preserved in a private collection that a researcher accessed in the late 1990s. The letter was not about messing. It was about something else entirely, and the reference appeared almost incidentally, embedded in a paragraph discussing a discussion the letter's author had had with his colleague about the nature of coincidence and how much weight, if any, a thoughtful person ought to give it. His colleague, the physician who had received the note, had apparently shown it to him sometime after the revolution and said, in words he remembered closely enough to quote in the letter, that she had looked at it many times in the years since Messing had given it to her without ever feeling she understood it, and that watching the coverage from Tehran she had felt, for the first time, that she did. Not a confident understanding, not a sense of revelation, just the particular feeling, she had told him, of a piece finally finding where it belonged in a picture whose shape had previously been invisible. The letter writer did not describe seeing the note himself, only hearing his colleague describe it. This is the second hand that serious researchers note carefully because it represents exactly the kind of transmission through which detail can shift and emphasis can be added retrospectively. What he preserved, however, was a texture, a quality of the physician's manner in describing the note that he characterized as neither excited nor distressed, but simply quiet. The quietness of someone who has been sitting with something for years and has finally been given, by external events, a context in which to speak of it without feeling that speech itself was the problem. Other accounts from this period are thinner, less clearly sourced, harder to evaluate. A memoir published in Sofia in 1987 by a cultural figure who had moved in circles adjacent to official Bulgarian institutions during the 70s contained a passage, brief, almost buried in a longer section about the cultural atmosphere of the period, describing a conversation he recalled having with someone who worked directly with Vanga, in which that person had mentioned that Vanga had spoken unusually in the period around 1974 about what the author remembered being described as a sleeping country that was preparing to speak. He attributed this recollection to a single conversation and acknowledged he hadn't thought of it again until the Iranian Revolution, after which he had tried to locate the person who had told him and found that this was no longer straightforward. The passage is 3 sentences in a book of several hundred pages. It attracted no attention when the book was published. A researcher found it in the late 90s and noted its existence in a footnote. It remains there, too small to build on, too specific to entirely dismiss. What began to happen through the 1980s, as the Soviet system moved through the final phases of its own transformation and the possibility of speaking more freely about previously suppressed material slowly expanded, was less a flood of testimony than a slow seepage. Individual recollections surfacing in individual contexts, separated by distance and by the different institutional cultures from which they emerged. A Bulgarian journalist, a Russian letter writer, a memoirist in Sofia, a researcher following a footnote. None of these people were in contact with each other. None of them appear to have been aware, at the time of their respective disclosures, of the others. And yet the material they surfaced pointed consistently toward the same narrow window. The early 1970s, the imagery of fire and ancient roads, the sense among people who had been near both figures during that period that something specific had registered in each of them about a place and a future that official analysis would not catch up to for years. This consistency across disconnected sources is what serious researchers describe as the most difficult feature of these accounts to set aside. Individual memories can be shaped by subsequent events. Groups of people in contact with each other can unconsciously align their recollections around a shared narrative. But scattered individuals, unknown to each other, retrieving similar details in different countries across different years, present a pattern that the contamination hypothesis has to work harder to explain. Not impossible to explain through ordinary means, but harder. And in a story that has never offered easy certainties, harder is the closest the available evidence has ever come to anything resembling weight. What accumulates across these 8 voices, the physician, the translator, the official, the letter writer, the memoirist, the colleagues who remembered without prompting, the researcher following a footnote in a forgotten book, is not proof. It is something more modest and, in certain ways, more durable than proof. It is the record of people who carried something quietly for years and eventually, in different ways and different places, found that the weight of it required acknowledgement. Small testimonies, individual and imperfect, but pointing with a persistence that resists comfortable dismissal in a direction that the official record, with all its resources, had entirely failed to face. The question of whether the Soviet state formally engaged with either Wolf-Messing or Vanga as sources of analytical input is one that researchers have approached from several directions over the past 3 decades, and from every direction they have encountered the same fundamental obstacle: the absence of documentation that would settle the matter in either direction. This is not in itself unusual for sensitive Soviet-era programs, but it is worth examining carefully because the absence here has a particular texture. It is not the absence of material that was never generated, but something that looks more like the absence of material that was generated and then managed. The distinction matters because one is silence and the other is the shape left by something removed. Begin with what is established. The Soviet Union maintained, across several decades of the Cold War, a genuine and institutionally serious interest in what its researchers termed psychotronics, a broad category that encompassed the study of human perceptual capacities that exceeded ordinary explanation, the investigation of individuals who appeared to demonstrate unusual accuracy in describing hidden or future events, and the systematic attempt to determine whether such capacities could be understood, replicated, or operationally applied. This was not a fringe pursuit. It was funded. It was staffed by credentialed scientists. It produced internal reports that circulated within the relevant institutions and that, in the post-Soviet period, became partially accessible to researchers. The programs existed under various administrative designations across different decades, and their scope and seriousness varied, but their continuity across the Cold War period is not in dispute. among serious scholars of the era. What is in dispute, what has never been resolved, is the degree to which individuals outside these formal research programs, people with public reputations rather than institutional affiliations, were brought into contact with this work. Former participants in Soviet psychotronics research, speaking after 1991, gave accounts that were consistent in describing the existence of programs, but inconsistent in describing their personnel. Some described work conducted exclusively with unknown subjects, ordinary people who had come to official attention through specific demonstrated incidents and who were then studied without any public profile. Others described, more carefully, the monitoring of publicly known figures whose outputs were tracked and assessed from a distance rather than through direct engagement.
A third category, direct consultation with well-known individuals in which the individual was aware of the institutional nature of the contact, was described by fewer people and with noticeably greater hesitation. Messing's position within the Soviet system was unusual in ways that are relevant to this question. He was not simply a tolerated eccentric. He had been, at various points in his career, an object of active state interest, monitored, evaluated, and, according to the most persistent accounts, occasionally summoned for demonstrations before figures whose rank was not publicly acknowledged. He lived with a degree of supervision that was real and documented in general terms, even if the specific records have not been fully opened. This supervision had a dual character. It constrained him, but it also, in a paradoxical way, confirmed his significance. Soviet institutions did not expend sustained supervisory resources on figures they had assessed as entirely without value. The monitoring of Messing, maintained across decades and through multiple changes in the political climate, implies an ongoing institutional judgment that he was worth watching. What was done with what was watched is the question that the available record does not answer. Vanga's relationship with Soviet and Bulgarian official structures was, in certain respects, more visible than Messing's, and that visibility makes its opacity all the more striking. She was not hidden. She operated openly, receiving visitors in a house that became, over time, a semi-official destination, accessible through a registration and waiting system that involved local authorities administered by staff whose appointments were not entirely private in nature. The Bulgarian state's relationship with her was openly ambiguous, neither endorsing her publicly in ideological terms nor suppressing her, which, in the context of a communist government, represented its own form of institutional decision. Foreign visitors came, officials came, and according to accounts that were reported widely enough to be considered part of the established public record, Soviet figures of senior standing came as well. Leonid Brezhnev's reported visit, or visits, depending on the source, to Vanga is one of the most frequently cited and least thoroughly documented details in the entire history of her public life. Multiple accounts describe it. No official record of it has been confirmed. The accounts agree on certain elements: that the visit or visits occurred during the 1970s, that they were conducted with a kind of discretion that senior Soviet figures brought to activities they did not intend to enter the official record, and that their content was never disclosed by any party who could speak to it directly. What Brezhnev asked, what Vanga said, what either of them took away from the encounter, these details have circulated only as layers of reported recollection, each layer removed from any direct source.
Former members of Vanga's staff, when asked about such visits in later interviews, responded in ways that confirmed the general shape of the account without providing specifics. They had been present. There had been visitors whose identity was not to be discussed. They had been asked to leave the room. The rooms from which people were asked to leave are, in a sense, the central subject of this part of the story. Every thread that runs through the question of Soviet institutional engagement with either Messing or Vanga eventually arrives at a closed door. A meeting whose content was not recorded. A file whose location cannot be established. A visit that participants acknowledged in outline and declined to specify.
This pattern is consistent enough across enough separate accounts that it has led several researchers to the same conclusion, stated with varying degrees of caution. That the absence of documentation in this case is not the natural absence of things that did not happen, but the managed absence of things that did happen and were considered sensitive enough to require that management. That conclusion cannot be confirmed. It is a reading of absence, and absence is inherently ambiguous material. A former Soviet archivist who spoke to a documentary researcher in the early 2000s made a distinction that is worth preserving here. She noted that in her experience, routine sensitive material tended to be classified, placed in restricted access rather than destroyed, leaving at minimum a record of its existence even if its content was withheld. Material that disappeared entirely, leaving not even a classification notation, had typically been handled outside normal archival procedure. She was speaking generally, not about Messing or Vanga specifically. But researchers who later described her comments in the context of this inquiry noted that the pattern she described, disappearance rather than restriction, matched what they had found when looking for records relating to official contact with both figures during the relevant period. What can be said in the end with reasonable confidence is this. Two of the most closely watched unconventional figures in the Soviet bloc existed within a system that was simultaneously serious about psychotronics research and serious about managing the visibility of that seriousness. Both figures attracted official attention that went beyond passive tolerance. Both left archival gaps in the period that is most relevant to this inquiry. And both produced in that same period fragments pointing toward a transformation in Iran that official analysis would not anticipate for years. Whether these facts are connected by institutional design, by coincidence, or by something that resists both categories is a question the evidence does not resolve. What it does is refuse to let the question go. And that refusal, quiet, persistent, grounded in real gaps in the available record, is perhaps the most honest summary of where the Soviet intelligence question, decades after it first became askable, continues to stand. The distance between Iran in 1974 and Iran in the early 21st century is not simply a matter of decades. It is a transformation of category, a country that moved from being one of many pieces on a regional board to becoming the piece around which the board itself was reorganized. This did not happen quickly, and it did not happen in a straight line. It happened through a series of accumulating decisions, conflicts, and alignments that each added another layer to what Iran was becoming in the strategic imagination of the world's most powerful states. By the time that transformation was fully visible, and it was not fully visible for many years, What had been anticipated by almost no one in the mid-1970s had become so structurally central to global politics that imagining the world without it required a genuine effort of historical imagination. The revolution of 1979 was the rupture. But ruptures do not by themselves create gravity. What followed in the decades after Khomeini's return was the gradual construction of a regional architecture built partly by design, partly by the logic of conflict and survival, that gave Iran an influence extending far beyond its borders in ways that the Shah's government, for all its resources and ambition, had never achieved.
Since the Islamic Republic's inception, Iran anchored networks of allied groups across the region. Most significantly, Hezbollah in Lebanon, whose transformation from a local militia into one of the most militarily capable non-state actors in the world owed a structural debt to Iranian training, funding, and strategic direction that no serious analyst disputed. Through Iraq, through Syria, and eventually through Yemen, Iran extended what it described as an axis of resistance, a phrase that was simultaneously ideological framing and accurate strategic description of a web of relationships giving Tehran operational reach across a vast arc from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea. Iran extended two political-footprint-regional-power-or-global-contender. The nuclear question, which became the defining diplomatic preoccupation of the first 2 decades of the new century, added a different dimension to this gravity. From 2002 onward, when Iran's previously undisclosed enrichment activities first attracted sustained international attention, the country's nuclear program became the subject of negotiations involving the world's most powerful states: the United States, Russia, China, Britain, France, and Germany, conducted over years with a seriousness and intensity that placed Iran at the center of the most consequential diplomatic processes of the era. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, reached in 2015 after years of intricate negotiation, represented an investment of political capital by multiple major powers that would have been unimaginable to any analyst observing Iran from the outside in 1974. A country that had once been a regional ally of Washington had become the subject of the most complex multilateral arms negotiation since the Cold War's formal arms control treaties, negotiated at the same table by the very powers whose rivalry had defined that earlier era. N.Wikipedia, https://en.wikipedia.org/wiki/joint_comprehensive_of_action. What this arc represents, stripped of its political content and viewed simply as a demonstration of accumulated strategic weight, is precisely the kind of transformation that the phrase, "the world will hear it," might have been understood to describe, if one were inclined to read Vanga's words through the lens of what actually followed. Not a single dramatic event, but a decades-long process of a country finding and asserting a voice in the architecture of global power that had no precedent in its recent history. Iran's position as a bridge between the Arab world, Central Asia, and the Caucasus, its unique geographic depth, its ancient civilizational self-understanding, its particular combination of resource wealth and ideological conviction, all of these gave the Islamic Republic tools that previous Iranian governments had possessed but never deployed in this particular configuration.
The world that emerged from 1979 was not simply a world in which Iran had changed its government. It was a world in which Iran had changed its role. https://www.iemed.org/publication/iran-a-geopolitical-in-the-east/. It was against this backdrop, the decades of accumulating consequence, the nuclear negotiations, the proxy networks extending from Beirut to Sana'a, the global sanctions regimes, and the diplomatic frameworks built to contain or engage a country that could no longer simply be ignored, that a small number of researchers began returning to the fragments from 1974 with renewed attention. Not journalists, not conspiracy theorists operating at the fringes, but researchers with institutional affiliations and methodological seriousness who had been studying the documented outputs of both Messing and Vanga for other reasons, and who, in the course of that work, encountered the Iran-related material and found themselves unable to categorize it cleanly. The connections they drew were acknowledged by all of them to be speculative. None of them published strong claims. What they described, in the careful language of people who understood the difference between pattern and proof, was a difficulty, the particular intellectual discomfort of encountering material that resisted the available explanatory frameworks without quite providing grounds for constructing a new one. One Bulgarian researcher working in the early 2000s on a broader documentation project concerning Vanga's recorded statements described placing the phrase about silk and fire alongside a timeline of Iranian geopolitical development and finding the correspondence, not between the phrase and any single event, but between the phrase and the entire arc, more precise than he had expected. The image of a new word rising and the world hearing it mapped in his reading not onto the revolution itself, but onto what the revolution initiated, a process by which a country defined for centuries by ancient identities, silk roads, sacred fires, imperial memory, reasserted those identities in a form that the modern world was structurally unprepared to receive. He was careful to note that this reading was retrospective, that retrospective pattern recognition is among the most unreliable of human cognitive habits, and that he was not claiming predictive validity for the phrase. He was claiming only that the phrase, applied to what actually happened, fit with an accuracy that made casual dismissal feel insufficient. A Russian researcher examining Messing's documented outputs during the same period made a narrower observation. He noted that the word Persia, rather than Iran, the name by which the country had been officially known since 1935, carried a specific implication that had only become fully visible in retrospect. The Islamic Republic, from its earliest ideological self-presentation, had drawn heavily on pre-Islamic Persian identity as a source of civilizational legitimacy. The ancient greatness of Persia invoked alongside Islamic heritage in the construction of a national narrative that the new government used to distinguish itself from what it characterized as the Shah's Western-oriented betrayal of Iranian depth. Khomeini's revolution was, among other things, a reclamation of Persia, of the older name, the older identity, the sense that something ancient had been temporarily suppressed and had now returned. The word Messing wrote, if it pointed toward this, pointed not merely toward a country, but toward the specific historical layer of that country that the revolution would bring back to the surface. Whether this reading is valid or ingenious is a distinction the evidence cannot make. But the researcher noted it carefully as one more detail that refused to resolve itself into mere coincidence. HTP.orans that footputted-global- was not a confirmation of anything that had been said or written in 1974. It provided a scale. The scale against which the fragments from Petrich and Moscow could be measured, and against which, measured honestly, they did not appear as small as the context of their origin might have suggested. One word on a piece of paper, one phrase spoken in a stone house and then retracted.
Set against decades of geopolitical transformation, nuclear diplomacy, regional war by proxy, and the sustained global attention of every major power on Earth, set against all of that, the fragments do not grow into proof, but they grow into something. Something that researchers who encountered them in the context of this fully unfolded history found themselves describing with varying degrees of reluctance as more than noise. There is a moment in any serious inquiry when the responsible thing to do is slow down. Not because the material has been exhausted, it has not, but because the accumulation of detail, if left unexamined, creates its own momentum, and that momentum can carry a narrative past the point where evidence ends and supposition begins without the transition being clearly marked. 10 parts have been spent building a picture carefully. Now the picture deserves to be looked at from a distance, and the looking has to be honest enough to include the possibility that what appears to be a picture is, in certain lights, simply a collection of unrelated marks. The first framework is the one that deserves to be stated first, because intellectual honesty requires it, and because it is the framework that any serious researcher reaches for before any other. Call it the coincidence argument, though that name slightly undersells its explanatory sophistication. Both Wolf Messing and Vanga were prolific producers of statements across very long careers. Messing performed publicly for decades, spoke to hundreds of individuals privately, and was around people constantly throughout his adult life. Vanga received visitors in numbers that, by the accounts of those who managed her schedule, sometimes reached dozens per week across years and decades. The total volume of statements, phrases, images, and predictions attributed to either of them across all sources, all witnesses, all levels of documentation is enormous. In any sufficiently large body of symbolic and intuitive output, some portion will, by statistical inevitability, appear to correspond to significant later events. This is not manipulation or fraud. It is the ordinary operation of probability applied to human pattern seeking, which is among the most powerful and least reliable of our cognitive capacities. The mechanism by which this produces the appearance of foresight is well understood. Events that seem predicted are remembered and repeated. Events that were predicted and did not occur, or predictions whose targets never materialized, are quietly forgotten, set aside, allowed to dissolve into the general background of statements that turned out to be wrong. This is not a conscious process of deception on the part of witnesses. It is simply how memory works under the pressure of significance. After 1979,
Everyone who had heard either figure say anything that could be connected to Iran reached for that memory and held it forward. The hundreds of things said during the same period that connected to nothing in particular remained in the background where they had always been. The note with Persia survived not because it was the only unusual thing Messing said in his final years, but because it was the one that subsequent events gave a home. The phrase about silk and fire survived not because Vanga never spoke in imagery that pointed nowhere in particular, but because this imagery pointed somewhere that the world had since made unmissable. Under this framework, the story told across these 10 parts is real. The note existed, the phrase was spoken, the accounts are genuine. But its meaning is retrospective construction rather than anticipation. Entirely human, entirely explicable, and, in its own way, entirely unremarkable.
The second framework is more difficult to dismiss and more difficult to articulate with precision, which is perhaps why it tends to attract either too much credibility or too little, depending on the disposition of whoever is examining it. It does not require supernatural mechanisms. It does not require institutional programs or official consultations. What it requires is the recognition that two people who spent their entire adult lives in unusually close contact with large numbers of other human beings, absorbing their fears, their hopes, their unspoken preoccupations, their readings of the world, may have developed a sensitivity to collective human patterns that resembled foresight without being prediction in any strict sense. Messing, performing across the Soviet Union for decades, was in contact with an enormous cross-section of Soviet society. He was, by every account, acutely sensitive to the unspoken content of human communication, the things people carried below the level of their articulated thoughts. Vanga received visitors from across the Soviet bloc, including people from many countries and many institutional backgrounds, including, according to accounts, people with access to information about regional developments that ordinary citizens did not possess. Whether she processed that information consciously or through some less traceable channel, she was, throughout her working life, a convergence point for a vast amount of human experience and concern. Under this framework, what Messing may have perceived in writing Persia was not a mystical vision of the future, but a synthesis, a compression of signals absorbed over years from the human world around him, signals that individually meant little, but that together pointed toward a region accumulating the kind of historical pressure that eventually becomes transformation.
And what Vanga may have expressed in her interrupted session was something similar. The surfacing, through whatever process she used, of a collective unease about a particular part of the world that was present in the minds of many of the people who had sat across from her, without any of them having named it explicitly. Neither of them would have been predicting in this model. Both of them would have been reflecting, with unusual fidelity, something that was already present in the human atmosphere of their time, waiting to become visible to the rest of the world. This is a genuinely interesting possibility, and it requires no departure from materialist explanation. It requires only the acknowledgement that human sensitivity, operating at the edge of its range, might occasionally produce outputs that looked like prophecy from the outside, while being, from the inside, simply an unusually precise reading of what is already there. The third framework is the one that requires the most careful handling, because it is the one most vulnerable to being stated in ways that exceed the evidence, while also being the one that, if accurate, would carry the most significant implications. It begins with a simple observation that has been established across earlier parts. Soviet institutions were serious about psychotronics, were serious about long-range regional forecasting, and were serious about managing the visibility of their work in both areas. It adds to this the documented reality that both Messing and Vanga existed within the Soviet system at levels of visibility that made entirely informal relationships with official structures implausible. And it proposes that what may have connected these elements was not a formal program of prediction, not Soviet analysts treating Messing or Vanga as oracles to be consulted for geopolitical guidance, but something more pragmatic and more limited.
The possibility that certain outputs from both figures, encountered through the normal channels of Soviet institutional life, were noted, retained, and placed alongside other analytical material as one data point among many in a broader assessment of regional futures. Under this framework, the significance of Persia and the Silken Fire phrase is not that they predicted the Iranian Revolution. It is that someone, somewhere in the Soviet institutional structure, read them in the context of other material and found that together they produced a signal worth taking seriously, not acting on directly, not treating as intelligence product in the formal sense, but holding. Filing in whatever category was available for inputs that did not fit standard classifications, but that had, over time, demonstrated a reliability worth not discarding. This would explain, without requiring extraordinary claims, why analytical attention on Iran appears to have increased in certain Soviet institutions during the mid-1970s, not because a clairvoyant had issued a warning that triggered a response, but because a pattern of inputs, of which unconventional signals were one small part, had collectively shifted the assessment of a region toward longer and more serious attention than it had previously received. All three frameworks contain things that are true. All three contain assumptions that cannot be fully verified. The coincidence argument is correct that retrospective pattern recognition is a genuine and powerful cognitive phenomenon that explains a great deal of what humans believe to be meaningful correspondence. The intuitive synthesis argument is correct that unusual human sensitivity is a real capacity whose mechanisms are poorly understood and whose outputs can occasionally produce results that resemble foresight. The institutional engagement argument is correct that Soviet structures existed and operated in ways that are not fully documented, and that certainly included unconventional elements whose relationship to conventional analysis has never been clearly mapped. What none of the three frameworks can do, individually or together, is close the question. Each of them accounts for some of the available material. None of them accounts for all of it. And the gaps between what the coincidence argument explains and what it leaves unresolved, between what intuitive synthesis can account for and where it reaches its explanatory limit, between what institutional engagement implies and what the absent records refuse to confirm, are not small enough to set aside without feeling that something important is being avoided. Which is, perhaps, the most honest place to leave the three frameworks. Not ranked, not synthesized, not resolved into a single preferred reading, but standing alongside each other in the particular tension that genuine ambiguity produces. Three ways of looking at the same collection of facts, each internally coherent, each incomplete, and between them, in the space where they overlap without agreeing, the shape of something that the available evidence can outline but not name. There is a small piece of paper somewhere in Moscow, or there was. Whether it still exists, whether the decades have been kind to it, whether the hands that held it have found a final place for it, is not something anyone who has told this story has been able to confirm. What is known is that it existed, that a word was written on it in careful, deliberate handwriting by a man who understood, better than almost anyone around him, the difference between what could be said and what needed to be preserved in a form that outweighed explanation. One word. And across the distance of several countries and hundreds of miles, in a stone house pressed against a Bulgarian mountain range, a phrase arrived through a woman who had not asked for it, was spoken into a room that had no context for it, and was then withdrawn without elaboration. Silk, fire, a new word rising. The world not ready. Return to these two moments long enough, and something begins to happen that is difficult to describe without either overclaiming or dismissing. The moments do not grow larger. They do not accumulate new detail or resolve into clarity. What they do is become more precise, the way a distant object sometimes sharpens when you stop looking directly at it and let peripheral vision take over. The note is still one word. The phrase is still ambiguous, preserved in slightly different forms by slightly different witnesses. Nothing has been added. But the precision with which they locate themselves within the history that followed, the revolution, the decades of consequence, the world reorganizing itself around a country that in 1974 barely registered in most official forecasting, that precision becomes harder to treat as noise the longer it is examined honestly. What has never been properly asked across all the years since these fragments first came to light is the simplest version of the question. Why Persia? Why them? Why both of them? Not as a rhetorical gesture toward mystery, as a genuine inquiry into what it would mean if the answer were anything other than coincidence. Because the coincidence answer is available, and it is not wrong exactly, but it is insufficient in a specific way. It accounts for the possibility that the fragments exist without explaining why, among the vast output of two prolific and closely documented figures, these particular fragments have this particular quality of fit. Coincidence is a real phenomenon. But coincidence of this texture, pointing in this direction, with this consistency across independent witnesses, in this narrow window of time, asks more of the concept than the concept was designed to carry. The intuitive answer, that Messing and Vanga were each in their separate ways processing the accumulated human signals of their era and occasionally surfacing patterns that the world had not yet consciously formed, is more generous to what is actually known about both figures and more consistent with what their closest observers described. Neither of them operated through mechanisms that are understood. Both of them operated with a consistency across long careers and under conditions of genuine scrutiny that resists reduction to performance or fraud. If they were doing something real, something that drew on the human world around them with unusual fidelity, then the question of what that world was already carrying in 1974 about the future of Iran becomes genuinely interesting, because the signals were there. The pressure was building. The ancient civilization beneath the modern state was moving toward an assertion that would shock everyone watching from the surface. Perhaps two people who had spent their lives attending to what lay beneath surfaces simply felt it before the surface broke. And the institutional answer, the possibility that somewhere in the closed rooms of Soviet analytical culture, someone placed these fragments alongside other material and found in the combination a signal worth attending to, remains open in the way that all unresolved archival questions remain open. Not confirmed, not refuted. Surrounded by the particular silence that managed absences produce, which is different from the silence of things that never happened. The files are not there. The meetings are not recorded. The visitors to the stone house in Petrich never disclosed what they asked or what they heard in response. These are facts. What they mean is not. Sit with all of this long enough, and what emerges is not an answer, but a feeling, a specific kind of intellectual unease that honest inquiry sometimes produces when it arrives at a genuine boundary. Not the boundary between the known and the unknown, which is comfortable and familiar, but the boundary between the explainable and the merely unexplained, which is a different and more unsettling place to stand. The explainable has frameworks. The merely unexplained has only the stubborn persistence of its own existence, the fact that it is there, that it was witnessed, that the witnesses were real people with no evident reason to fabricate, and that what they described has outlasted every attempt to either confirm or dissolve it. Wolf Messing died in November of 1974. He had, in his final months, grown quieter in the particular way that those who knew him recognized as meaningful, a withdrawal not into absence, but into a more concentrated form of presence, as though the energy that had once expressed itself outwardly had found a final interior focus. The note was already in the physician's drawer. Whatever he had wanted to preserve, he had preserved. What he understood about what he had written, no one who was with him at the end was in a position to ask clearly or receive clearly. He took that understanding with him, which may have been precisely the intention. Vanga lived for more than 2 decades after her interrupted session in 1974, long enough to see the revolution she may or may not have anticipated, long enough to watch Iran become the center of the world, long enough that one might imagine asking her, toward the end of her life, whether she remembered that afternoon in Petrich, whether she knew what her phrase had come to mean in the minds of those who had held it. Those who were with her in her final years reported that she rarely discussed previous statements, rarely showed interest in the question of whether she had been right or wrong about anything. She lived forward, not backward, which was perhaps its own form of answer. The question of what she had seen or synthesized or been used to carry, she never addressed directly. It remained, like the note and the phrase and the empty archive shelves and the meetings whose content was never disclosed, among the things this story holds without resolving. Why Persia? Why 1974? Why 2 people operating independently in different countries, through different languages, through different relationships with the world's invisible dimensions, both turned toward the same ancient land in the same narrow window of time, years before that land rewrote the political architecture of the world. The story has laid out every thread it found. It has examined them carefully and honestly, and without the pretense of a conclusion that the evidence does not support. What remains, after all of that, is the question itself, intact, undiminished, and in certain ways more precise for having been examined this carefully. Not an open wound, not a comfortable mystery, something in between. The kind of question that does not ask to be answered so much as it asks to be held and to be passed carefully to anyone willing to hold it next. If something in this account stayed with you, if one detail returned after you thought you had moved past it, or if the question at the center of this story feels to you like a question worth continuing to carry, the other stories in this series are waiting. Each of them begins in the same place, with a fragment that official history set aside and that refuses, on examination, to stay set aside. The comments below are a place where what you think about this can meet what others think.
Not to reach agreement necessarily, but because this kind of material thinks better in company than alone. And if this story felt to you like the kind of thing that deserves to exist, like a question worth asking in a world that sometimes moves too quickly past the things it cannot immediately explain, then leaving that acknowledgement here, quietly, is its own form of holding something that might otherwise be forgotten.